All right, here we go. Living now, living right now. This is L.Nathan here, your host here for this next hour at WFO 96.5 FM, Power 96.5 FM on your dial. Our principal sponsor, of course, is the Community Action Organization of Western New York, still fighting the war on poverty, now in our 52nd year. And in fact, I want to make people aware that come June 8th, we will begin our 53rd year. And you can come and you can celebrate with us on June 8th at our annual luncheon. We're doing a luncheon this year rather than doing an annual dinner. It's the 53rd one that we have done. It's the 53rd one that we have done. And so you can participate in helping us not only celebrate our 53rd year, you can also help us to support each other as we seed into our youth programs, we seed into our neighborhood development programs, our home improvement resource program. We use these resources to help us to be able to help neighborhood organizations, block clubs, and other community-based organizations when they're doing their annual programs and so on, to be a part of a network of a community where everyone is working collectively to help everyone else. That's what we do with our resources that we gain through our annual dinner. So you can contact us at 881-5150. That's 881-5150. Ask for Yvonne Hairston or Catherine Roberts, and they will give you all the information. It's $50. We've been doing it for $50 forever. And but we want to try to stay within that vein so that our coming together is affordable for us, and we use sponsorships and so on to help us to raise these resources. We hope to. It'll be at the Buffalo Convention Center. It'll start at 12 o'clock. It'll run from 12 to about 2:15. So we look forward to seeing you all there. Please come. Please sign up. Please get there. We need as many people as we can. So I want to welcome all of you into this hour of insight, introspection, and interpretation of facts, events, and trends affecting you right here and right now in Buffalo and the Western New York community, and in fact connect you to communities all across the country. Each week we focus on things we think will be of interest to you, which will serve to motivate you and will serve to connect you to the broader issues that affect our communities here in Western New York. Today's program is live. You can call in and join our discussion. I hope that you will. Our number here again is 837-1112. That's 837-1112. We have an early caller. I'm going to grab that caller real quick. Hi, caller. Are you there?
Yeah, hi, Mr. Hare. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you feeling?
Good.
Yep. My sound in here isn't coming through. Yep.
What's that? Are you able to hear me?
I can hear you. It sounds like you're in an echo chamber, though, but just keep talking.
No, I'm trying not to be. I'm just in a room in the craziness of cell phones, I guess.
Okay, so you're going to talk to us about the Every Student Succeeds Act, right?
Yeah, that's and the
test
assessments that are coming up this week. Yeah,
and the test.
Exactly.
So let me just start you out on this conversation, because this is the part that really puzzles me. It seems to me that the fundamental purpose of having standardized tests is so that we know that everybody who tests at a certain level, we know exactly what that means in terms of how much they've learned in terms of math and science and reading. And so if you have a standardized test and you get a score of 12, then I know that 12 means I have a certain understanding of what that 12 means in terms of what you've learned. If you get a score of 90, I know what that means. Whereas if you leave testing up to individual teachers in individual schools, we know that a 90 in one school might not be the same as a 90 in another school. And I'm saying this to you, just so you're the truth in lending. I went to a school where they considered the grades at Bishop Fallon to be like premium grades. You got like extra points for being, if you had a 90 average at Bishop Fallon, they counted that like a 95. Whereas if you went to certain other schools, you had a 90, they might not count that better than a 75 or a 70 and so on. Am I making sense?
No, you're totally making sense. I mean, look, that's the purpose of the assessment, right? And you're mentioning ESSA at the beginning is right, because it is federal law, and the federal law is that you want to make sure that kids at the same age, growing up, in the same state, no matter where they're growing up, are being assessed on the same things, right? So this week's assessment, which is English language arts in grades 3 through 8, which over 1 million kids in New York State are eligible to take, it's the only piece of work that every student across the state does. So as you say, it's actually rated 1 through 4, right? So, you get a 2 or 3 there, it's actually a true 2 or 3 compared to kids across the state. And the other really important thing that it does a couple of important things. One, for individual students, it helps identify strengths and weaknesses in the 3 subjects that you just described, math, English language arts, and science, so that parents, then teachers can know where to focus. And 2, because it's the only universal assessment that everybody's taking, you get a sense of where the achievement gaps are and where resources need to get focused. In places like Buffalo, frankly, and even within the district itself, to make sure that kids, no matter where they're growing up, are getting an equal chance at educational success, which hasn't happened in the past.
That's what really gets into my craw about this thing, because I always ask myself, whose interests are being served by this campaign to get people to and they always, if you notice in the newspaper today, and they say this all the time, they say that there's like roughly 200,000 kids out of 1.2 million kids in the state. The kids choose or refuse to take the test. Kids don't refuse to take a test. They don't refuse to eat. They don't refuse to be driven to the store. Kids don't have any choice. It's you, the parent. You're the one doing this, right?
No, I think a lot. Well, I think a lot of kids are glad to be given the choice not to take the test.
I'm pretty sure that's the case.
Right. I mean, it's another important point, right? It's like kids. You have to teach kids how to take assessments, right? I mean, they're going to be tested on things their whole lives,
right?
Whether it's, driving or professional certificates or even the school assessments that really count later in life, the SATs, the ACTs, the Regents exams, etc. These tests really they're almost practice for that, and
right.
I'm not sure why people would turn their backs on free practice, because they don't get used to evaluate the teachers. They don't get used for grade promotion or any of those things. They really are just a barometer that parents and teachers and schools can use to know where kids' strengths and weaknesses are in those subjects, and one that the state uses to know where it needs to direct resources so that kids are getting a more equal shot.
And as you know, we talked about in the press conference last week, this is really an important point. If you look at children who grow into people who can read, count, and process scientific principles at a 10th grade level or better, you almost never see those children in family court. You almost never see those children in juvenile court. You almost never see these children in criminal court when they get to be 17, 18, 19 years old. These people almost always have settled lives. They almost always are working. They almost always get to college and so on. So if what your goal is to get your child to a place where your child is going to have economic and social stability for the rest of their lives, getting them to this threshold is the surest way to get that done. Why would you not want to know that your child is not on path to get there? It's a very interesting question. It's a good point. It's one that we don't talk about enough and should talk about more. And I heard you talk about it last week. We think a lot in terms of, because what these benchmarks were developed as was a college and career readiness benchmarks for the 21st century, which are hard, right? I mean, I think as you said last week, work is with your brain now. It's not so much with your hands and your arms and legs, right? Yep. So those are hard benchmarks, and so it really is just measuring against those benchmarks. But as you also pointed out, being able to know along the path, 3rd grade, 5th grade, 7th grade, et cetera, that your child is on grade level, right, or close to expectation, does also really matter to kind of making successful human beings, right? To knowing that that they've reached a place essentially that is that kind of what you just described as that kind of minimum threshold to live a stable and settled life. I mean, these are your children. If you don't want your children to succeed, if you don't want it, who on earth should have, other than child herself or himself, who on earth has a higher stake in the success of your child other than you, right? So you got to want to see that your child succeeds. So I always think of it like this. If a child is in the first grade, well, let's say the way the tests go, they start from third grade. So let's say the child is in the third grade, and you find this child is a quarter to a half a grade level behind. That's a much easier gap to close than to wait until the child is in the 10th grade and the child is still reading at the 4th and the 5th grade level.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that's really the purpose of these assessments. And I think a lot of people argue a lot of things about these assessments, but what you just described hits the nail on the head. That really is the purpose of the assessments, to get ahead of challenges early, right? And to start to close those challenges early. Look, just to be fair, because I learned that when you make any kind of argument or opinion, to really flesh it out, you have to present the other side. What the opponents argue is that the assessments are more than that. That they're not fair. That they teach kids that they're failures. That they're too long. That there's too much test prep around them, etc. The reality is, some of those things may have had some truth when the tests were first rolled out 5-6 years ago, but there's been an enormous amount of improvements made. They're much shorter. They're written and reviewed by teachers themselves in New York. There are caps, state legislated caps, less than 2% of time you can use in the classroom during the year on preparation, not just these. So a lot of the things that have been stated about these assessments, while there may have been some truth to them in the past, are just not true today, and the opponents sort of refuse to take yes for an answer and move on.
Right, and even the idea of the things you talked about. The tests are shorter now. The teachers claim they get more input. Mm-hmm. Although, as I recall, about 400 teachers were involved in the construction of the original Common Core test.
In the first place, that's right. Now you have 22 New York teachers who review every single question.
Right. And so that, I get all of that. I want people to understand also that the time on testing that people were whining about over the past four years or so, that the kids spend all of their time, preparing for the test. Let's be clear about this. The children do not decide what they're going to be doing in the classroom day to day. The teachers and the principals decide that. So if you've got kids who are spending 15 out of 22 hours in a week, whatever the hours are, in test preparation, that's a decision that's being made by the teachers and the principals. That's not a decision being made by the children. You don't have to do that. Now, I don't know how old you are, but in my era, the only time you prepared for a test was usually the day before a test. Right?
I don't want to admit to that, but yeah.
But I mean, the curriculum, the way that the teachers taught, they just spent the whole semester or quarter, because they taught you worked in quarters, seven week or so quarters, and the teachers just taught the material that was to be taught during that quarter. And then when you got near quiz time, or you got near test time, or you got near midterm times or finals times, then you do some, sort of review and prepare yourself. Right. So why is that not the same thing? Who decided that you didn't teach the course anymore? You just spent all your time teaching a kid.
Here's what shouldn't be a secret. It is still the same thing.
Okay.
That is still how schools teach. I mean, it's not. I don't know of a lot of schools that are spending 15 of 20 hours a week doing test preparation, because they can't.
Right.
It's not how you have a curriculum that you have to follow, just as you suggest, right? So you have to continue to move forward on it, and you have standards, right, which are in place, which are the foundation for these assessments. You have standards that you have to get to every year. And third, as I described, you now have state legislation that says you can't spend more than 2% of your academic time during the year on any test prep. So So that's not what's happening in the
Right.
classroom.
So those issues should be
is what you discussed. What's happening in the classroom is just what you described. Kids are learning. They're learning a curriculum, and then they're being tested on that curriculum in the regular way that they're tested during the year in their own schools. And once a year, in grades 3rd through 8, they're tested on ELA and math to see how they're doing vis-a-vis kids around the whole state.
Right. And if you're doing effective teaching, the kids should learn. So, I studied Chaucer and Tolstoy and Dickinson, and Shakespeare. Yeah. And when it came time to do the preparatory Scholastic Achievement Test or the National Scholastic Achievement Test or whatever version was coming up in the year that I was in high school, you were already prepared to do it because that's what you were doing all during the course of the year. So this is really, in my view, it's a scam. And the way you have to understand it is whose interests are being served by the campaign against testing, against common standard testing. Whose interests are being served? It certainly isn't in the interest of the student. It can't be in the interest of the parent. How is the parent's interest served by not knowing whether or not their child can read and count and understand scientific principles on grade? So the only people who can be benefiting from this are people that are afraid that the information that is learned from the test will come down to some assessment as to how good you are as a principal in your school, how good your school district is, how good the teachers are in your various school buildings. And my understanding is that's not even in the queue anymore. That's just a fear that people have. And they will deny parents, families, and children the benefit of knowing enough to be able to drive their own education bus because they're afraid that the information may turn into some assessment on whether or not they teach well.
Right. That's right. I mean, look, for individual parents and students, knowledge is power, right? And that's all this is more knowledge and more information. So as you say, I don't see the benefit to them of not having more knowledge and another important piece of information.
So I am adamant about this, right? That every single parent, everybody who knows somebody who has a child, you should be pushing for that child, those children, to take the test. Because the test is something that is going to benefit you no matter who else feels they are benefited or not benefited from the test. It always benefits you. Every single time you do the test, it benefits you as the parent, as the student, because you get to know where you are and what you have to do to get your child where you want your child to be. That's got to be 100% good for you, and you shouldn't worry about whether it's good for somebody else. You should just do this, right?
Yeah. Well, listen, we appreciate your support and your advocacy for this because it's important for people in Buffalo and around Western New York to hear from leaders like yourself to know the value of these assessments. And if there's this week on Wednesday and Thursday, April 11th and April 12th.
Okay, and if people need to get any information to help them contextualize what we're talking about, or
please go to our website. It's highachievement.NY.org. So it's highachievementny.org.
ny.org. Excellent.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much.
We're going to keep pushing. Thank you. Good. We'll be talking to you again soon. All right. God bless.
Yes,
all right. Listen, why don't we take our first break, and then we'll get into today's subject. If you all stick with us, we will see you on the side of the break here at Living Right Now.
Do you want to increase your home's value? Do you want to lower your energy bills? Are you in need of affordable financing for organization of Erie County?
All right, welcome back to Living Now here at WFO 96.5, Power 96.5 FM on your dial. This is L.Nathan here, your host. We're here with Emmanuel Radford, who is doing the live streaming of the program. If you want to see the program live, if you have a handheld device, you have a computer where you are, you can type in Facebook, right, and then type in Living Now, and the program will come up. If you want to make some observations or some comment or ask a question, you can type it in, and Emmanuel will get the question to me, and we'll try to get to those questions on the air as best as we can. I want to talk about something a little bit, that sort of builds on the issue that we have been talking about over the past couple of weeks. I call it No Way Out. Black male youth trapped on a pathway to prison. But I want to put this into a context for us. Try this reality on for a size and see if this fits you. And according to Michelle Alexander, who is the author of a best-selling book called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness. Yeah, just wrap your mind around that. Mass incarceration in the age of color blindness. She says, quote, more black men are in prison or jail or on probation or parole than were enslaved in 1850, before the Civil War began. Now, that may sound, like that doesn't make sense. There were pretty close to, I think, 4.5 million African people living in the South when the Civil War began, almost all of whom were enslaved people. Think about the number of African people that are in jail, on parole, in prisons. When you look at this, on probation. When you look at this entire situation, it is clear that we have replaced the formerly enslaved population with an informally enslaved population. Let me help you with that, because I know most of the increase that we have seen in the incarceration or entrapment of Africans, particularly African males, in the prison system has been due to the war on drugs, a war waged almost entirely on people of color. Even though all studies show, not just me in my opinion, but all studies, including the studies that are done by the Bureau of Crime Statistics for the Justice Department, through the Health and Human Services and so on, show that Caucasians use and sell illegal drugs at rates equal to or higher than African people. In some black inner city communities, 4 of 5 black youth can expect to be caught up in the criminal justice system sometime during the course of their lifetime. 4 out of 5. Yet, the percentage of Caucasian people who use drugs, illegal drugs, and the percentage of African people who use illegal substances are almost the same, and when they're not the same, it's more highly utilized amongst Caucasian people than it is among African people. So why are African people 4 times more likely to end up in prison as a consequence of being involved with drugs, right? So the question then becomes, why are African males disproportionately entrapped in the criminal justice system and living lives with a high degree of exposure to systemic discrimination in public school administration, in police discrimination, in court adjudication discrimination, in employment discrimination, in mortgage loan discrimination, in commercial loan discrimination, and just about every area of the economic and social structure of the country outside of sports and entertainment. And I suspect you can find some forms of discrimination even in those industries. So let's begin at the beginning. Because when you start having this kind of discussion, you got to get to the root, right? So let's start at the root of this. Let's start with the 13th Amendment, because I know y'all felt real good. Thank you. And slavery is abolished in the United States. I want you to read. Just read it with me. In fact, let me read it to you. Okay? In case you don't have your Constitution out. 13th Amendment, quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now, we read that sentence, we repeat that sentence over and over and over again in society. 13th Amendment abolished slavery. If you actually read the sentence, that's not what the 13th Amendment says. The 13th Amendment says that slavery itself is the punishment for being duly convicted of a crime. So if you want to keep a body of slaves available to you in your society, all you have to do is just get people convicted. And how do you get people convicted? You take behavior that is non-criminal and make it criminal. You're not feeling me. I'm talking about the root of something, okay? So in 1865, supposedly the Civil War ended. Everybody got nice. We set it along the path of a colorblind society and whatnot. But what happened when the formal institution of enslavement ended? And all of those African people that had been enslaved on these plantations all over the South and who were semi-enslaved all over the North and the West. We're going to get to that too, okay? Because that Southern thing about slavery, we need to get to that whole story. But all of those African people that were on those plantations that now no longer were connected to those plantations as formal enslaved people. Where did they go to work the next day? If slavery was abolished, let's just say July 1, 1865, if that's when it was abolished, it was actually a slightly different date, but if it was abolished on that date, then on July 2nd, where did you go to work? Oh, you didn't think about that, right? So what happens is you have a high percentage, a very high percentage of African males who are now unemployed. Immediately, they are all unemployed. Now, there's 4.5 million African people in the South alone.
Are they still living on the plantation?
So, well, they're living wherever they were living. So I presume they're living in the same shacks and sheds and whatnot that they were living in. The barracks they were living in, before. That's assuming that the Caucasian landowner would allow them to live there.
Yeah,
they could have just sent the revenuers out, the patrols out and so on, and kicked them off of the plantation. Say, if you're not going to be my slave, you can't live in this house, right? And so now you got a bunch of unemployed and homeless African people, particularly males. So what does this society do? The very first thing that they do in the South, and it became emblematic across the North, they made being unemployed and homeless a crime. It was, you literally were committing a crime by not having a job and not having a house to stay in. That became a crime. So the very first thing that happened to African people as a consequence of the so-called abolishment of slavery was the creation of 1.5 to 2 million unemployed, half homeless African people who are now committing a crime because you made being homeless and unemployed, you made that a crime. They called it idleness. You got convicted of idleness. And if you get convicted of idleness, you can go to jail. And if you go to jail and you can't do the fine for the time, you can be put into chain gangs. And anything you do while you're in custody can become another offense. You could get convicted of something and be sentenced for 30 days and spend 3 years or 5 years in prison. This was done legally in the United States. Legally in the sense that the legal apparatus of this country did it. It wasn't legal in the sense of any kind of morality. You commit these abominable crimes on African people for 250 years. You murder and rape and enslave and rob and pillage African people for all of that time. And then once this system supposedly, has been brought to an end, instead of going to the people that you did all of this to and finding a way to help those people, you found ways to punish those people for not turning into middle-class people the day after slavery. That's how this thing got started. That's the root. Garakai Chengu is the author of an article that appeared in Counterpunch in December of 2015. The article's title was "How Slaves Built American Capitalism." You have to follow this to understand what's really going on. Supposedly, capitalism and slavery are fundamentally counterposed systems. In other words, one is based on free labor and the other on forced labor. However, in practice, capitalism itself would have been impossible in the United States without slavery. In the United States, scholars have demonstrated that profit wasn't made just from Southerners selling the cotton that enslaved Africans picked or the cane that they cut. Slavery was central to the establishment of the industries that totally dominate the U.S. economy today: real estate, insurance, and finance. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with cotton? With picking, rice and indigo and stuff like that, tobacco. Well, Wall Street, famous Wall Street, was founded on slavery. African slaves actually built a physical wall that gives Wall Street its name. In other words, when they took Manhattan from the Native Americans for like $24 worth of trinkets and whatnot, when the Native Americans got back home, they probably thought that they just gave them these trinkets and whatnot as, how you get somebody a cake, it's a, like a goodwill offering or whatever. They didn't think they had sold the island. So they came back to get the island, and the Americans said, oh, no, we bought the island for you for them 24 hours, for $24 worth of trinkets. That was the island. That was the price for the island. No, we didn't go for that price. They built a wall on the northern face of New York to keep Native Americans from attacking the English, okay, or the Dutch rather. So, forming the northern boundary of the Dutch colony designed to ward off resisting natives who wanted their land back. To formalize the colossal trade in human beings in 1711, New York officials established a slave market on a street that they named Wall Street after the wall between the Dutch colony and the Native Americans. That's where Wall Street gets its name from. That's not in the South, is it? Okay. Many prominent American banks, including J.P. Morgan and Wachovia Corporation, made their fortunes from slavery, accepting enslaved African people's lives as collateral for loans. You got to hear me on this now. J.P. Morgan recently admitted that it accepted approximately 13,500 African lives as property, as collateral for loans being made by J.P. Morgan to people who wanted these loans. And because some people defaulted on their loans, J.P. Morgan wound up taking 1,250 of those African people directly into the possession of J.P. Morgan as the property forfeited for defaulting on the loans. That's just J.P. Morgan. This was done all over this country, okay? The story that American school books tell of slavery is that slavery is regional. It's a Southern thing rather than national. It portrays slavery in the United States as a brutal aberration to the American rule of democracy and freedom. Slavery is always talked about as an unfortunate detour from the nation's march toward becoming a modern country, and certainly not the engine that drove America's prosperity. Read the text. Read Chengu's text. It's called How Slaves Built American Capitalism, written by Garakai Chengu, Chengu. Read his text in Counterpunch. You will see that what they're telling you could not be further from the truth. Black people in America live in a racial capitalist system. This is Chengu's thesis. Racial capitalism exercises its authority over the black minority through an oppressive array of modern-day lynchings by the police, increasing for-profit mass incarceration and institutionally driven racial
call on one.
Economic equality. We have a caller calling in. So racial capitalism is unquestionably a modern-day crime against humanity. That's the piece that has to be understood. I need for you to also understand that when the so-called institution of slavery was abolished, when that supposedly occurred, guess who got paid? The people that committed this horrific, abominable crime on African people. The slave owner, they're the ones who got paid. They got restitution because they had to suffer from the loss of their slaves. You lost your life. You lost your mind. You lost everything, your history, everything about you, your dignity, everything about you was taken from you. Okay? Even your ability to speak your own words. All that was done to you. You didn't get any restitution for that. The person who did this to you, they got restitution. Okay? I don't know if I can grab that caller. Here we go. Hi, caller. Are you there?
Yes, sir. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing?
I'm thankful. I enjoy your research and your analysis. I think that if people really want to understand, they got to start rethinking things that they've been told, taught, and almost come to believe. Mm-hmm. And, one of the things you talked about people, the whole thing about enslavement, and they never really included or thought of us as people.
Right.
Maybe still don't. But in terms of the language that we use, I heard the brother and the technical person mentioning plantations. Mm-hmm. And, to me, we have to stop calling them plantations. We have to call them what they were, which was forced labor camps.
Right.
And they forced more than just labor.
They were like gulags. Right.
It was more than just labor. So, the language, we still, have a tendency to call him master, slave master, instead of enslaver, kidnapper. We still have a tendency to call it slavery rather than human trafficking, mm-hmm. because they just don't want to consider us humans, whether it's the 3/5 clause or whatever.
Yep.
That we have to really think, and we have to really think what freedom really truly is. Truly. Well, you have to think whether being set off the plantation but still being held under the jurisdiction of those who have enslaved you is called something even akin to freedom.
Yeah.
But I appreciate, like I said, I started off, I appreciate your research and your analysis, and I'm going to stop and listen to the rest of it.
All right. Thanks, Brother Kamal. And Brother Kamal raises another point. I won't be able to get into a lot of detail on it right in this show, but I just want you to do something for you, do some homework. There is a Supreme Court justice. He was the Chief Justice. His name was Roger B. Taney, Taney. He was the Chief Justice on the court that heard the case of Dred Scott. And if you read his defense of his decision, you will understand what Brother Kamal just said. Because he argues in his decision, the decision that actually became the decision of the court, he argued that at no time in the history of the United States this is 1856 when this case was actually decided. At no time in the history of the United States was it ever envisioned that an African person was considered to be a human being. That's not alluded to. He actually says that in his decision, that at no time were they referred to as being a man. At no time was an African person considered to be a man or a human being, right? That is the fundamental underlying principle, right? Because what does that mean? That means that no matter what they say to us about the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, it doesn't change the fact that for all of the history of this country before then, everywhere in this country, they thought that African people were something other than human beings, like we were talking monkeys or something, right? And so that underlying premise, that didn't go away, on the end of the Civil War. It didn't go away when the 13th Amendment was ratified. This was still the basic premise of how these people thought, and that's why so many things don't work. That's why, even though you supposedly became a citizen with the 14th Amendment, you still couldn't do what citizens do. You still couldn't go to the movies. You still couldn't go to the restaurants. You still couldn't go to the park. You still couldn't buy from certain places. You couldn't stay at certain inns. You couldn't vote. You couldn't run for office. If you're a citizen, why weren't all of those things automatically conferred on you? Because that's what citizens had the right to do. Because your citizenship was not the same. Other people's citizenship is person-based citizenship. The Constitution talks about all these rights that persons have. In fact, if you read the 14th Amendment, it refers to persons too. It doesn't talk about citizens. It says that persons can become citizens, but the right to become a citizen is conferred on a person. Well, if you're not a person, you don't get citizenship, do you? That's another story for another day. Okay, I just want to get that out there, right? But back on this issue, historical literature is clear that prior to the Civil War, a legally sanctioned police force existed for the sole purpose of oppressing the slave population and protecting the property and interest of Caucasian slave owners. I think we ought to take our break now. Before we do, Lee, should we take our break? Yep. All right, I'm going to get back into this subject. So if you all stick with us, hopefully making some kind of sense, we'll see you inside of the break here at Living Right Now.
Do you want to increase your home's value? Do you want to lower your
FM on your dial. We have a caller hanging on. Let me grab that call real quick. Hi, caller, are you there?
Yes. Good morning, Mr. Hare.
Good morning, Mother Dora. How you doing?
Well, I am truly elated this morning because I am beginning my last official course.
All right.
In my doctorate program before I write the dissertation. I just got an email of congratulations of making it to this point. So I've been on spring break for the past week and a half, so now it's time to get down to business. So I look forward to this last course. But I appreciate your information, your research, your sharing it with the community because, that's one of the reasons I continue to write and do research on our history because there's still too many people who do not know this history, both black and white, and I think everybody needs to know it. And we just have to continue educating our people and the nation as a whole. The sad thing is that so many of our youth are coming through school without any of this history, any of this information. But we just have to keep making an effort. And one of the reasons I share my journey onto this doctorate degree is to encourage people to continue to learn. And I really like what Brother Kamal says. Learning is a lifelong endeavor. You never stop learning. And if you're able to do it at my age, I'm a great-grandmother, and I'm struggling along in this in these classes that I'm taking, but I'm learning so much. And so I just kind of wanted to share that. And I want to end by saying that I have a $100 essay contest, Mr. Hare.
Okay.
And if you get the recent issue of the Challenger, it's in the Challenger. But it's for adults ages 21 and over. And now there are 6 questions to answer, but the main question is, should teachers be armed in the public schools? In the wake of all of these mass shootings, that's the main question. But I do caution people, whatever you say, if you say yes or you say no, you must explain your answer.
Defend your position. That's right.
Defend your position. And it's funny. As I go around the city and I talk about this contest and I repost that question, the first thing people do, and they actually shout it, they say no. And then when they finish shouting, I said, okay, why? Give me a reason.
And they got nothing to say.
They get silent. So if they want to win that $100, and that's the first place prize, they must give me complete answers. And so the deadline is April 20th. They can either email them to me or the essays, or they can take them to the Meriwether Library. Just drop them off at the Meriwether Library by April 20th. So I just wanted to share that with the community and remind people. And thank you so much, Mr. Hare. And when I hang up, I'm starting my first assignment.
All right.
Thank you for your
good
show.
luck. Thank you, Mother Doyle. Keep on trucking. You're doing a great, great job. And so when I talk about this issue of the police evolving around the function of oppressing the slave population and protecting the property and interest of the Caucasian slave owners, the glaring similarities between the 18th century slave patrols and the modern American police brutality in the black community are just too salient for you to ignore. You can't miss that these appear to be the exact same thing. You need to remember that in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, a system began to evolve as a consequence of the Denmark Vesey Rebellion, the Nat Turner rebellions, the Gabriel Prosser, rebellions, where in South Carolina, then in Virginia, then in Maryland, they developed something they refer to as patrols. And the idea of these patrols came along with other laws that said that you couldn't have 2 or more or 3 or more African people congregating together, talking amongst themselves without, a Caucasian in their midst. Otherwise, that was a crime. It was like you were engaging in public insurrection or something, okay? If you were just talking amongst yourselves, you were not allowed to do that. If you went off in the woods, away from the whatever population base was on these gulags, these slave camps that Brother Kamal was referring to plantations as. If you were, away from your gulag, that's what I'm gonna call it. Your a concentration camp, then you could be arrested by patrols. The patrols would be going through. That was their job. They go through the woods and whatnot. If they see African people, gathering together, even if it was for a prayer service, you could be arrested, and they will put you on something called a paddy wagon. Doesn't that sound like what we got going on today? So now you have African people that are gathering around a store or on a porch or at a corner or in a schoolyard or, someplace, a empty parking lot. And, they're talking loud or drinking, whatever it is they're doing. And all of a sudden they get oppressed by the police and so on. We have a question coming in.
So what is the root of the 13th Amendment? If they were going to make the law hurt black people anyway, why even make the amendment?
Well, the purpose of the amendment was to break the idea of having these huge amounts of land sucked up by plantations. We have to understand what the real issue was for the conflict between the North and the South. It really did not begin with the North having this idealistic, idea that we should abolish slavery, and the South saying, "Oh no, we want to keep slavery." That was not the issue. The issue was the North was already committed to developing itself as an industrial economy, a manufacturing economy that required a lot of resources, wood, iron, copper, tin, and so on. And where was that stuff? Some of it was in the ground in the north, but the most easiest accessible resources were under the ground in the south. The South was saying, oh, no, I know y'all want to develop and become a modern country, but y'all got to do it up there because we're living the life of Riley, down here, on these so-called plantations and so on. So that was the real issue. But by abolishing slavery and freeing all of these African people from the plantations, it made it possible for the Northerners to be able to repossess the lands of the South, or have Southerners who were willing to accept the idea that the plantation economy was going to die, and you had to move towards a more manufacturing kind of a society, or become the place where the resources for manufacturing came from. That was what you were going to have to do. So that was the reason why I believe why the 13th Amendment was passed. We have another caller. Hang on. Hi, caller. Are you there?
Yeah, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Good there, good. Question there. Why here in the United States there's so little evidence of speak about the slavery in the North when you said about Wall Street?
Right.
Even the road Broadway was built by slaves.
Right.
On Manhattan Island. But the Dutch was here for like 60-some years.
Yep.
65-some years. And they enslaved us, and the French were here. And I don't hear anything about it. Cause they showed a few years ago on, public television, they found a slave cemetery right outside of Plymouth.
Right.
Right there at Plymouth Rock.
Well, I actually visited one in New York City. Took my daughter there, where there was a graveyard, that had, over 150 or so African people that had been buried in this graveyard. But the reason why you hear this, it's, whoever is in control of a country or a part of the country, they get to control the narrative. They get to control how things get characterized. And so the North wanted to give itself the image of being a moral, noble entity fighting to overcome this horrible institution of slavery in the South, when the North's real agenda was to get access to the resources that were under the ground in the South. And the plantation economy made it difficult, if not impossible, to access those resources. And so the North was able to create a narrative to give a moral high ground to their position. And of course, the South was fighting to preserve the evil that they built their entire social and economic structure around, which was the capturing, enslavement, kidnapping of African people, and so on. And so that's the reason why you see the literature, everything that we learn in our schools, almost all of the literature, the newspaper accounts and so on, all give you this framework as if the oppression of African people was something that happened in the South. The racism against African people was a Southern thing and so on. I need for people to understand, on your question, on your point, the black codes that were the basis of Jim Crow legislation, the black codes did not originate in the South. The black codes originated in Illinois, in the North. Okay? The Ku Klux Klan didn't even start in the South. Okay? They started in the North, right? You had one of the biggest Klan operations, in the country in Binghamton, New York, right? I mean, Lockport still has parades every year where they celebrate, not directly the Klan nation, but the basic premises of the Klan ideation is celebrated in a parade in Lockport, New York today. So
I have a question.
Yep.
Part of it too. All these social justice organizations, from NAACP, CORE, SNCC, all the way up to modern time, there's very little mention about Woodrow Wilson. He had a big thing to do with the black codes.
Yep. He was one of the most heinous possible people ever to be, as far as it related to African people, in the history of the United States. He was no different than Stonewall Jackson, and the worst of those people. He was just a few decades later in time. but the same kind of person and whatnot. You're absolutely right.
But why do they consider Wilson liberal? What's liberal progressive about?
Well, he was considered to be liberal in the sense that he did the chicken in every pot kind of theorem for his administration, where he supposedly was for the working man. He was for higher wages. He was for making home loans more accessible for people. He was the one who was responsible during that period of the First World War, and so in order to at least the thesis of his campaign and his government was to make things work for all of those people that were fighting in the First World War and who were dying in the First World War. So he was more aligning himself as a populist, representing the interest of that portion of the population. So they call him a liberal. But just because you're a liberal doesn't mean you're not a racist. You can be a liberal and be you can be a liberal and be a racist. They got the clock on me right now. I'm sorry. We're going to have to pick this up next week. I really appreciate your input. Look forward to talking again next week. Thank you all out there for supporting us. We have a lot more we have to do on this subject. We're going to keep it on until we get us all on a space where we understand what's going on and have a good idea about what we ought to do about it. We'll talk to you all next week here at Living Now, Living Right Now.